She thought she was buying protection, but neither of them knew the truth. That this marriage was built on secrets, revenge, and a war that hadn't even begun. What happens when trust is just another weapon, and love grows in the middle of lies? This channel brings you stories of the Wild West: cowboys, love, motherhood, human kindness, and the bonds that hold people together. The lesson? Sometimes the people we fear are the ones who end up saving us. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The Dust Haven County Jail smelled of stale whiskey, wet earth, and the distinct metallic tang of a man whose time had run out. Silas Holden leaned the back of his head against the weeping stone wall, watching a sliver of pale moonlight crawl across the dirt floor. Through the tiny barred window near the ceiling, the sky was beginning to bleed from pitch black into a bruised, violent purple. 2 hours until dawn. 2 hours until the hangman tightened the knot. Silas didn't feel fear. He'd lived his entire adult life with a target on his back and a gun on his hip. Death was just an old acquaintance finally dropping by for a visit. He only felt a cold, bitter knot of frustration. To survive a decade of hunting the worst scum in the territories, only to be framed for murder by a cowardly cattle baron like Harlan Croft, it was an insulting way to die. The heavy iron door at the end of the corridor groaned in protest. Silas didn't stand, but his eyes tracked the flicker of lamplight bleeding into the corridor. Keys clattered. Heavy boot steps, Sheriff Miller, by the clumsy sound of them, echoed down the hall. But there was another sound, too. The sharp, purposeful click of a woman's heeled boots. Miller stopped in front of Silas's cell, holding the lantern high. His face was slick with nervous sweat. Behind him stepped a woman wrapped entirely in mourning black. She didn't belong in a place like this. The hem of her dark dress was caked with red trail dust, and her clothes were practical, worn at the edges. But it was her posture that caught Silas's attention. She didn't shrink from the smell of unwashed bodies or the shadows. She stood like a loaded Winchester rifle, slender, quiet, and incredibly dangerous. "This is him?" Her voice was smooth, but it carried a cold authority that made the sheriff flinch. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Hayes," Miller stammered, his eyes darting toward the street outside. "But like I told you, Harlan Croft expects him on the gallows by sunrise. I can't just—" "You can, and you will, Sheriff." Evelyn Hayes reached into her dark cloak and dropped a heavy canvas pouch onto the small stool outside the cell. The unmistakable muffled clink of gold coins silenced the lawman instantly. "The Territorial Indentured Labor Act of 1878, Evie stated, reciting the words as if she'd memorized them in the dark. "A citizen of good standing with property can pay a condemned prisoner's bounty and assume full legal liability for their labor. I am paying his debt." Silas slowly pushed himself off the wall, his heavy chains rattling like a bag of dry bones in the quiet jail. He stepped into the light of the lantern. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and lean, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and eyes the color of a winter storm. "You're buying a dead man, lady," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Evie stepped closer to the iron bars. She had to tilt her head up to meet his gaze, but she didn't step back. Her eyes were a striking, piercing amber, completely devoid of tears or terror. "I am buying a husband," she corrected flatly. "And a gun." Silas raised a dark eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "My husband Arthur died 6 months ago," Evie said, her voice dropping lower, meant only for him. "By law, if a widow doesn't remarry within half a year, her property rights revert to the county. Harlan Croft owns the county. He wants my land. Tomorrow he takes it." She stepped even closer. Silas could smell lye soap and the faint scent of rain on her skin. "I offer you a deal, Mr. Holden. Marry me. It makes you my legal ward and gives me a male protector on paper, keeping Croft's hands off my deed. You work my ranch for 3 months until the federal circuit judge arrives to review your case. 3 months of hard labor in exchange for keeping your neck out of a noose. Silas stared at her. It was madness. She was a widow backed into a corner, desperate enough to walk into a dungeon and chain herself to a condemned killer. But as he looked into those amber eyes, he saw no panic. He saw a burning, calculated defiance. "Croft will kill you for interfering," Silas warned. "He's going to kill me anyway," Evie replied without missing a beat. "Do we have a deal, or should I let the sheriff fetch the rope?" Silas studied her for a long, silent moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched into a ghost of a smirk. "Sheriff," Silas drawled, holding his chained hands out toward the bars. "Fetch the paperwork." 10 minutes later, they stood in the jailer's cramped, dusty front office. The sun was just beginning to crack over the horizon, casting a bloody light through the window. Sheriff Miller, trembling and rushing through the territorial civil marriage vows, looked like he might be sick. "Do you, Silas Holden, take this woman?" "I do," Silas interrupted, impatient. "And do you, Evelyn Hayes?" "I do," she said firmly. "I need a ring," Miller muttered, wiping his brow. "Legal requirement for the ledger." Evie froze. She hadn't thought of that. Her bare hands gripped the edge of the wooden desk. Silas's eyes scanned the cluttered room. He reached out and picked up a heavy, rusted iron washer left over from a broken door hinge. He wiped the grime off it with his thumb, then reached for Evie's left hand. Her fingers were calloused from hard work, but small and warm. He slid the cold, heavy iron washer onto her ring finger. It was a stark, ugly contrast, but it fit perfectly. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Miller breathed, slamming his stamp onto the document. "May God have mercy on both of you." Miller unlocked the cuffs on Silas's wrists. Silas rolled his shoulders, the muscles bunching under his worn shirt as he savored the freedom. But when he reached down to unlock the chains on Silas's boots, Miller only removed the left one. The sheriff left a heavy 10-pound iron shackle bolted firmly around Silas's right ankle. "What is this?" Silas growled, taking a threatening step forward. Miller scrambled backward, dropping the iron key onto the desk. "Croft would skin me alive if I let you walk out of here completely free. The law says you're her indentured ward. That means she holds the leash." Evie didn't argue. She calmly picked up the heavy iron key, her fingers brushing the cold metal, and slipped it into the deep pocket of her black dress. She looked up at Silas, her expression unreadable. "My wagon is out front," she said. Silas looked from the terrified sheriff to the iron cuff biting into his boot, and finally to his new wife. He let out a low, humorless exhale. He walked out into the blinding morning sun, the heavy chain dragging through the dirt with a sinister rhythmic clink, clink, clink. He climbed into the back of her wagon, tethering the end of his chain to the iron ring on the buckboard. Evie climbed into the driver's seat, taking the reins. She didn't look back at the town, and she didn't look back at him. She just cracked the whip. The game had begun. The wagon ride to the Hayes Ranch was a silent, grueling affair that dragged on for 3 brutal hours under the punishing New Mexico sun. Silas Holden sat in the back of the buckboard, his long legs stretched out among sacks of flour and coils of fencing wire. The heavy iron chain binding his right ankle to the wagon's iron tie-down ring rattled a steady, mocking rhythm with every rut in the road. It was a humiliating position for a man who had spent the last 10 years tracking the deadliest outlaws in the West. But Silas was a pragmatist. A bruised ego was vastly preferable to a broken neck. He kept his gaze fixed on Evelyn Hayes. She drove the 2-horse team with a rigid, practiced efficiency, her spine ruler straight despite the jolting of the wagon. Her black morning dress absorbed the midday heat, yet she didn't so much as dab her brow. She was an impenetrable fortress of grief and grit. Silas used the silence to do what he did best, assess his surroundings. As the wagon climbed higher into the foothills, leaving the dusty sprawl of the town below, the scrub brush gave way to towering ponderosa pines and jagged limestone outcroppings. The air grew cooler, thinner. High ground, Silas thought. his eyes narrowing as he calculated the elevation. When the wagon finally crested the ridge and rolled into the clearing of the Hayes Ranch, Silas felt a cold thrill of professional satisfaction slide down his spine. The property was modest, a sturdy log cabin with a wide front porch, a weathered but well-built barn, a corral holding 3 restless mustangs, and a windmill lazily cutting the air. But it wasn't the structures that impressed him. It was the positioning. The ranch sat on a natural plateau. To the east, the land dropped away into a sweeping valley, offering a commanding, unobstructed view of the main road leading into town several miles distant. To the west, the property was backed by a steep, impassable cliff face. There was only one way up here. It wasn't just a cattle ranch. It was a fortress. It was a sniper's absolute dream. Evie pulled back on the reins. Whoa. The wagon lurched to a halt in the center of the dusty yard. She secured the brake, climbed down without waiting for his assistance, and walked around to the back. Reaching into the deep pocket of her black skirt, she retrieved the heavy iron key the sheriff had given her. Silas extended his leg toward the edge of the wagon bed. He watched her face closely as she leaned in. She smelled of lye soap, horse sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender. Her fingers were steady as she slotted the key into the padlock, securing the chain to the wagon. With a sharp click, the chain fell away from the wood. However, she did not unlock the thick iron cuff clamped around Silas's ankle. A 3-foot length of heavy chain still trailed from his leg, ending in a broken, rusted link. "You're leaving the jewelry on?" Silas asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet of the yard. Evie slipped the key back into her pocket and looked him dead in the eye. "You are an indentured ward of this property, Mr. Holden. Until the circuit judge arrives in 3 months to review your pardon, the law says you are my responsibility. That iron stays on. It reminds us both of our arrangement." Silas stared at her. The sheer audacity of this woman was staggering. She was half his size, entirely alone, and she was putting a leash on a man who had killed more people than influenza. "Fair enough, Mrs. Holden," Silas drawled, intentionally using her new, legally binding name. Evie's jaw tightened at the sound of it, a brief flash of vulnerability breaking through her stoic mask before she clamped it down. "My name is Evie," she said sharply, "and we need to establish the rules of this arrangement." Silas hopped down from the wagon. The iron chain hit the dirt with a heavy clink, kicking up a small cloud of red dust. He crossed his arms over his chest, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her. "I'm listening." "Rule 1, Evie said, pointing toward the cabin. "You do not step foot inside my house. Ever. Your quarters are in the barn. I have set up a cot in the tack room, and there are wool blankets in the chest. Rule 2. You do not ask me about my late husband, Arthur. His life and his death are none of your concern. Rule 3. You do the heavy labor required to keep this place running, and you keep Harlan Croft's men off my land. In exchange, I feed you, I don't turn you over to the hangman, and in 90 days I sign your release papers. Do we understand each other?" "Crystal clear," Silas said. He reached down, picked up the dragging end of his chain, and looped it casually through his leather belt to keep it from tripping him. "Just one question, Evie." "What?" "That double-barrel shotgun you've got hidden under the driver's bench of the wagon." Silas nodded toward the buckboard. "You actually know how to use it, or is it just for decoration?" Evie's amber eyes flared with a sudden dangerous light. "I know how to aim," she said coldly, "and I don't miss. Keep that in mind while you're sleeping in my barn." Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched toward the cabin, her black skirts kicking up the dust. Silas watched her go, a dry, cynical smile tugging at the corner of his scarred mouth. Lord have mercy, he thought. She might actually be more dangerous than I am. He turned and made his way toward the barn. The interior was remarkably clean, smelling of sweet alfalfa, old leather, and horse manure. He found the tack room just as she had described. A modest canvas cot sat in the corner, a stark improvement over the stone floor of the county jail. But Silas didn't unpack immediately. He left his few meager belongings on the cot and climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft. The chain clanked against the wooden rungs, a heavy, dragging weight that irritated the scarred skin of his ankle. Reaching the loft, he walked to the large set of loading doors that faced the eastern valley. He pushed them open, just a crack. The view was magnificent. From this vantage point, Silas could see the ribbon of the dirt road winding all the way back to town. He could see the dark cluster of buildings that made up Harlan Croft's sprawling cattle operation in the distance. Silas leaned against the rough wood of the barn, his storm-gray eyes turning icy and calculating. He hadn't been captured in Dust Haven by accident. 3 weeks ago, Silas had tracked a man named Elias Vance, Croft's top enforcer and a ruthless assassin, to this very town. Elias was the man who had ambushed Silas's former bounty hunting squad 2 years ago, slaughtering them in their sleep. Silas had come to Dust Haven to put a bullet between Elias's eyes. But Croft's men had gotten the drop on him, framing him for the murder of a local prospector and tossing him in the sheriff's dungeon. Silas had thought his revenge was over. But then Evelyn Hayes had walked into his cell in her widow's weeds. He looked out over the valley. Evie's property wasn't just a ranch. It was the ultimate tactical high ground. Croft wanted this land desperately, which meant Croft's men would inevitably come to them. Silas didn't have to hunt Elias anymore. He just had to wait in this eagle's nest, rifle in hand, and let his prey walk right up to the front door. He felt a twinge of guilt, a rare emotion for him, about using the grieving widow as bait. But he pushed it down. He would protect her, he reasoned. He would honor the contract, keep Croft off her land, and in exchange he would get his revenge. It was a fair trade. Night fell over the mountain fast and cold. The temperature plummeted, the desert heat vanishing the moment the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. In the tack room, Silas lay on the cot, wrapped in 2 scratchy wool blankets. But sleep refused to come. The iron cuff around his ankle was freezing, acting like a conduit that sucked the warmth right out of his bones. Every time he shifted, the chain rattled, a loud, obnoxious sound in the dead quiet of the barn. Frustrated, Silas threw off the blankets. He pulled on his boots, his fingers lingering on the cold iron cuff, and walked out into the moonlit yard. The wind howled through the pines. Silas walked the perimeter of the property, an old habit from a lifetime of sleeping with one eye open. He checked the corral gate. He checked the tree line. Finally, his patrol brought him near the main cabin. The house was dark, save for a faint, flickering orange glow coming from the bedroom window. Silas knew he shouldn't look. Rule number 1, you do not step foot inside my house. Looking through the window felt like a violation of that boundary. But the instincts of a hunter overrode his manners. He stepped silently onto the porch, his boots making no sound, and peered through the glass. The fire in the hearth was dying down to embers. Evie was lying in her bed, but she wasn't sleeping. She was lying on top of the quilt, fully clothed in a simple cotton nightgown, her back rigidly pressed against the headboard. And resting across her lap, her white-knuckled hands gripping the walnut stock with terrifying desperation, was the loaded Winchester rifle. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the locked front door. She looked exhausted, haunted, and completely terrified. The cold, impenetrable facade she wore during the day had vanished, leaving behind a woman who was drowning in paranoia and grief. Silas exhaled a slow, quiet breath, his breath fogging the cold glass. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror every day for the last 2 years. It was the look of someone waiting for the monsters to kick the door in. He stepped back from the window, melting into the shadows of the porch. He didn't return to the barn. Instead, Silas Holden, the deadliest bounty hunter in the New Mexico territory, sat down on the hard wooden floorboards of the front porch. He leaned his back against the front door, stretched his chained leg out into the dirt, and rested his hand on the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. If the monsters came for her tonight, they would have to step over his dead body to get inside. The rhythmic, violent thwack of splitting timber echoed through the valley long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Evie stood on her front porch, a steaming mug of black coffee warming her palms, watching her newly purchased husband work. Silas had been at the woodpile for an hour. He had discarded his worn canvas jacket and cotton shirt long ago, working bare-chested in the crisp morning air. He swung the heavy 12-pound splitting maul with a terrifying, fluid grace. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. The massive iron wedge bit into the thick rounds of pine, cleaving them in twain with explosive force. Sweat gleamed on his broad shoulders, tracing the topography of heavily muscled arms and a torso littered with fading white scars. But it was the sound that Evie couldn't ignore. Swing, crack, clink. Every time Silas pivoted his weight, the heavy iron chain attached to his ankle dragged across the dirt and struck the chopping block. Clink, drag, clink, drag. It was a harsh, metallic reminder of what he was. A prisoner, a killer, a man she had tethered to her own survival. Evie took a sip of the bitter coffee, forcing her eyes away from the hypnotic ripple of his back muscles. She had slept for the first time in months last night. When she had woken up before dawn, she had opened her front door to find the imprint of a large man sitting in the dust of her porch, a clear line where his chain had dragged across the wood. He had guarded her door all night. It confused her. It terrified her. "You're going to break the handle of that maul if you keep swinging it like a madman," Evie called out, her voice cutting through the crisp air. Silas froze mid-swing. He lowered the maul and turned to face her, wiping a streak of sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather-gloved hand. His storm-gray eyes locked onto hers, intense and unreadable. "Wood needs chopping, ma'am," he said, his chest heaving slightly. Evie walked down the porch steps, carrying a second tin cup of coffee. She stopped 10 feet away from him, a safe distance, and held it out. "Drink this. I can't have my only ranch hand collapsing from dehydration on his first day." Silas closed the distance. The chain dragged heavily behind him. He took the tin cup, his large calloused fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a startling jolt of electricity up Evie's arm. She quickly pulled her hand back, crossing her arms defensively. Silas took a long sip of the scalding, pitch-black coffee. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a look of genuine appreciation crossing his rugged face. "Strong," he murmured. "Just how I like it. Much obliged." Before Evie could respond, Silas's eyes snapped open. The relaxed posture vanished instantly, replaced by a coiled, lethal tension. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, toward the eastern ridge. "Company," he said, his voice dropping an octave. Evie spun around. A plume of red dust was rising on the horizon, moving fast up the switchback trail. 3 riders. Even from this distance, Evie recognized the sleek, expensive black geldings. Harlan Croft's men. A cold spike of dread drove itself into Evie's stomach. They were early. She had thought she had at least a few days before Croft realized she hadn't surrendered the deed. "Get in the barn," Evie ordered, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Stay out of sight. If they see you, they'll know I went to the jail." Silas didn't move. He calmly poured the rest of his coffee into the dirt and handed the tin cup back to her. "Rule number 3, Evie. I keep Croft's men off your land. You go stand on the porch. Let me do my job." "Silas, no. You don't understand. These men are—" "I know exactly what they are," Silas interrupted, his eyes hardening into flint. He reached down and scooped up the 12-pound splitting maul in his right hand. "Porch. Now." There was a command in his voice that brokered no argument. Evie retreated to the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached behind the wooden pillar where she had propped her Winchester rifle, gripping the cold steel barrel. The 3 riders crested the ridge and rode directly into the yard, pulling their mounts to a halt just a few yards from the porch. The man in the center was Cullen Vance. He was a greasy, rat-faced man with a silver-studded gun belt and a cruel smile. He was Croft's favorite intimidator, the man who had harassed Arthur relentlessly in the weeks before his accident. "Morning, Widow Hayes," Cullen drawled, leaning heavily on the pommel of his saddle. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt, right next to Evie's blooming hydrangeas. "Mr. Croft sent us up here to check on you. Awful tragic about Arthur's horse spooking by the ravine. Mr. Croft worries a fragile little thing like you might have an accident out here all alone. He's generously offering to take the deed off your hands today. Save you the trouble of dying." Evie leveled the Winchester at Cullen's chest. Her hands shook, but her voice was pure ice. "You tell Harlan Croft he can rot in hell. This land is mine. Now get off my property." Cullen laughed, a wet, ugly sound. The two men beside him chuckled, resting their hands casually on the butts of their revolvers. "Now, Evie, there's no need to be hostile," Cullen mocked. He nudged his horse forward, closing the distance to the porch. He looked over at the wooden housing of the ranch's deep water well. "Shame about this well. Heard the groundwater up here can turn toxic overnight. Kills a herd of cattle in a day, kills a pretty widow even faster. Be a real shame if something got dropped down there." "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Cullen." The voice came from the shadows of the barn. It was quiet, but it carried the chilling resonance of a tomb closing shut. Cullen and his men jerked their horses around, hands flying to their guns. Silas Holden stepped out of the shadows. The morning sun hit his scarred chest and the heavy splitting maul resting casually on his shoulder. Clink, drag. He took a step forward. The iron chain scraped across the dirt. Cullen's eyes darted to the shackle on Silas's ankle, and then he let out a bark of nervous laughter. "Well, look at this. The widow bought herself a chained dog. What are you going to do, convict? Bark at us?" Silas didn't smile. He didn't break stride. Clink. Drag. He stopped 20 feet from the riders. He didn't wind up. He didn't pull his arm back. Using nothing but the explosive rotational force of his hips and shoulders, Silas pivoted and hurled the 12-pound iron maul. The heavy tool spun through the air with a terrifying rhythmic hum. It flew directly at Cullen's head. Cullen shrieked and threw himself backward in the saddle. Thwack! The iron wedge of the maul buried itself 5 inches deep into the solid oak beam of the water well structure, exactly 1 inch from where Cullen's head had been a second before. The wooden beam groaned under the impact, splintering violently. A lock of Cullen's greasy hair fluttered to the ground, severed perfectly by the blade of the maul. The yard fell dead silent. The horses danced nervously. Cullen was pale as a ghost, his hand hovering over his gun, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming violence. Silas walked forward. He didn't look at the other two men. His predator's gaze was locked entirely on Cullen. He walked right up to the side of the black gelding, grabbing the leather bridle to steady the panicked horse. "You're Cullen Vance," Silas whispered, his voice so low only Cullen and Evie could hear it. "You rode with the Miller gang in '81. You shot a pregnant woman in a bank robbery in Abilene. There's a $500 bounty on your head in the state of Texas, dead or alive." Cullen's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He recognized the man standing before him now. It wasn't just a convict. "You take one more step toward this house, Cullen," Silas continued, his tone perfectly conversational. "I won't need a gun to collect it. I will rip you off this horse. I will break your neck with my bare hands, and I will deliver your head to the marshal in a burlap sack. Do we understand each other?" Cullen swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, yanking his horse's reins so hard the animal reared. "Let's go!" Cullen screamed at his men. "Ride! Ride!" The 3 men spurred their horses, tearing out of the yard and kicking up a massive cloud of dust as they fled back down the mountain, fleeing as if the devil himself were on their heels. Evie stood on the porch, the Winchester slowly lowering to her side. Her heart was beating so fast she felt lightheaded. She had expected a gunfight. She had expected blood. She hadn't expected a display of sheer psychological dominance that broke three armed men in less than 2 minutes. Silas stood by the well, watching the dust settle. He reached out, grabbed the handle of the maul, and wrenched it free from the oak beam with a single, powerful yank. He turned to walk back to the barn, but as he pivoted on his right heel, he let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. His right leg buckled slightly. "Silas!" Evie dropped her rifle and ran down the steps. When he had thrown the maul, the violent torque of his body had whipped the heavy iron chain around. The rough iron cuff had severely gouged his ankle. Blood was pouring down his leg, soaking into the thick leather of his boot, turning the brown hide a dark, shiny crimson. "I'm fine," Silas grunted, trying to wave her off. He took another step and stumbled. "You are not fine, you stubborn idiot," Evie snapped, her fear instantly transforming into fierce maternal anger. She marched up to him, grabbed his uninjured left arm, and threw it over her shoulder. "Lean on me. We're going to the porch." Silas was too dizzy from the sudden drop in blood pressure to argue. He leaned a fraction of his weight against her. She was surprisingly strong, her small frame supporting him as they hobbled to the wooden steps. He sat down heavily on the top step, resting his elbows on his knees, gritting his teeth as the adrenaline faded and the fiery pain set in. "Stay right there, don't move," Evie commanded. She vanished into the cabin. Silas leaned his head back against the porch railing, closing his eyes. The iron cuff was a torture device. He had survived bullets, knife wounds, and desert heat, but this damn chain was going to be the death of him. A moment later, the screen door banged open. Evie returned carrying a tin basin of steaming water, a bottle of carbolic acid, a clean white towel, and rolls of cotton bandages. She dropped to her knees in the dust right in front of him. "I can do it myself," Silas protested weakly as she reached for his bloody boot. "Shut up, Mr. Holden," Evie ordered. "I own you for 90 days, which means I don't let my property bleed to death in the dirt." She worked quickly and ruthlessly. She unlaced his boot and pulled it off, eliciting a sharp groan from Silas. She rolled the denim pant leg up to his knee. The sight was gruesome. The iron cuff had rubbed the skin raw over the last 24 hours, but the sudden movement today had torn the flesh completely open, exposing the white tendon beneath. "This is going to burn," Evie warned, uncorking the carbolic acid. "Do it," Silas grunted, grabbing the wooden railing of the porch. Evie poured the antiseptic over the open wound. Silas's entire body went rigid. The muscles in his neck corded like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. Evie worked with gentle, precise hands, washing the blood away with the hot water, then packing the wound with clean gauze. She carefully slid the iron cuff higher up his calf over the thick denim to keep it off the raw flesh. "You need to take your shirt off," Evie said, her voice softer now, focusing entirely on the task. "Your back is covered in sweat and dirt from the barn. If it gets in this wound, it will rot the leg. I need to wash it." Silas hesitated. He had been shirtless just moments ago, but that was at a distance. Having her this close, having her see what was permanently etched into his skin, felt like exposing his throat to a knife, but the pain was throbbing, and he had no energy left to fight her. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, offering her his broad, scarred back. Evie took the warm, damp towel and reached up. She pressed the cloth to his right shoulder, wiping away the mixture of sweat and sawdust. She moved the towel across his spine, her touch light and careful. Suddenly, her hands stopped dead. Silas felt her freeze. He closed his eyes, bracing himself. Evie stared at the center of Silas's back. Taking up the entirety of his shoulder blades was a massive, horrific burn scar. The flesh was melted, puckered, and white, as if someone had taken a branding iron directly to his skin in a deliberate act of mutilation. But the burn hadn't erased everything. Around the edges of the destroyed flesh, dark black ink remained intact. Evie could clearly make out the hilt of a medieval sword and the snarling, ink-black snout of a wolf. Evie dropped the towel into the bloody basin, her breath caught in her throat. Living in the West, everyone knew the myths. Everyone knew the stories of the territorial marshal's darkest secret. A squad of elite bounty hunters, men who didn't arrest outlaws but eradicated them. Men who operated outside the law to do the things the law was too cowardly to do. They were ghosts. They were lethal. They were called the Phantom Company, and their insignia was a wolf pierced by a sword. "My God," Evie whispered, her amber eyes wide as she looked from the tattoo to the back of his head. "You're one of them. You're a wraith." Silas didn't turn around. He just stared out at the dirt yard, the iron chain heavy around his ankle. "There are no more wraiths, Evie," Silas said, his voice hollow and dead. "I'm the only one left." Evie sat back on her heels in the dust. She had thought she had bought a desperate convict. She had thought she was holding the leash of a wild dog. She looked at the man sitting on her porch, bleeding for her, and realized with terrifying clarity that she had shackled herself to a wolf. And the real danger wasn't Harlan Croft's men. The real danger was the man currently sitting on her front steps. The New Mexico sky did not gently transition into a storm. It shattered. By mid-afternoon, the horizon bruised a deep, violent violet. The wind howled down the limestone cliffs, carrying the sharp metallic scent of ozone and the heavy promise of a deluge. When the rain finally hit, it fell in sheets of freezing, blinding gray, instantly turning the ranch's hard-packed dirt yard into a treacherous mire of slick red mud. Evie was in the kitchen, frantically sealing the window shutters, when she heard the scream. It wasn't human. It was the high-pitched, panicked shriek of a horse in absolute terror. "Starling!" Evie gasped. Her prized Mustang mare, heavily in foal, was not due for another 2 weeks, but the sudden drop in barometric pressure had triggered it early. Evie didn't bother with a coat. She grabbed a kerosene lantern and threw her weight against the front door, fighting the howling gale to force it open. The rain hit her like a volley of icy buckshot, instantly soaking her morning dress through to the skin. She slipped and slid across the churning mud of the yard, the wind snatching the breath from her lungs as she sprinted toward the barn. She hauled the heavy wooden doors open, slipping inside just as a crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the earth. "Silas!" Evie shouted over the roar of the rain pounding the tin roof. "Back here!" Evie ran down the center aisle. In the largest foaling stall at the rear of the barn, Silas was already at work. He had discarded his shirt, his broad, scarred back gleaming with sweat and rainwater. A lantern hung from a rusty nail, casting wild, dancing shadows over the grim scene. Starling was down in the straw, her sides heaving violently, her eyes rolled back in white-rimmed panic. She thrashed her heavy hooves against the wooden slats of the stall. "She's breached!" Silas yelled, his voice rough and commanding. He was kneeling in the muck right behind the frantic animal. "The foal is turned, one leg is back. If she keeps pushing like this, she's going to tear herself apart, and they'll both die." "What do we do?" Evie dropped to her knees beside the mare's head, uncaring as the filthy straw soaked into her skirt. She grabbed Starling's halter, stroking the horse's trembling jaw, murmuring desperate, soothing nonsense. "I have to go in and turn it," Silas said grimly. He looked up at her, his storm-gray eyes intense in the flickering light. "Hold her head down, Evie. Put your whole body weight on her neck. If she tries to stand while my arm is inside her, she'll snap my bones like twigs." Evie didn't hesitate. She threw her upper body over the mare's heavy neck, pinning the horse as best she could. "Do it!" Silas took a breath, gritted his teeth, and reached deep inside the laboring mare. Starling let out a deafening, agonizing scream. The horse convulsed, 1,000 pounds of raw muscle reacting to the blinding pain and the intrusion. Evie dug her boots into the dirt, fighting with everything she had to keep the mare grounded, her own muscles burning with the effort. "Come on, you stubborn bastard," Silas grunted, his bicep bulging as he fought blindly in the dark, slippery confines of the womb, trying to locate the foal's missing leg. "Turn! Turn!" A massive clap of thunder exploded directly overhead. The sound shattered the mare's remaining sanity. Starling surged upward with an explosive burst of adrenaline, throwing Evie off her neck. As the horse violently scrambled to rise, her back right hoof lashed out in a blind, panicked kick. The iron-shod hoof caught Silas squarely on his left bicep. The sickening sound of tearing flesh and the dull thud of impact echoed through the stall. Silas was thrown backward into the wooden partition, a sharp grunt escaping his lips. "Silas," Evie scrambled to her feet, too. "I'm fine, keep her down," Silas roared. He didn't look at his arm, he didn't even pause. He threw himself right back into the muck behind the mare just as the horse collapsed back into the straw, exhausted. With one final agonizing heave, Silas found the foal's knee. He hooked his fingers around the joint, pulled it forward, and aligned it. "Pull!" he shouted. Evie grabbed the foal's slick front legs alongside Silas. Together, slipping in the blood and straw, they leaned back with all their combined strength. With a rush of fluid, the foal slid free onto the hay, a tiny, shivering, pitch-black colt. For a moment, the only sound in the barn was the deafening rain on the roof and the wet, ragged breathing of the three of them. The mare lifted her head, letting out a low, exhausted nicker, and began to weakly lick the amniotic sac from the colt's face. "He's breathing!" Evie choked out, a hysterical mix of a laugh and a sob escaping her throat. She wiped her rain-soaked hair out of her eyes. "Silas, we did it. He's—" She turned to look at him and froze. Silas was leaning against the stall wall, his eyes squeezed shut, his face drained of all color. His chest heaved erratically, and his left arm was completely bathed in crimson. The Mustang's hoof had laid his bicep open from the shoulder down to the crook of his elbow. The jagged, gaping wound was bleeding profusely, the dark blood mixing with the rainwater and mud coating his skin. "Silas, your arm," Evie breathed, the horror returning instantly. "I've had worse," Silas muttered. He tried to push himself off the wall, but his boots slipped in the straw. The blood loss, combined with the lingering weakness from his time in the county jail, was hitting him hard. He slumped back against the wood, his breathing shallow. Evie's mind raced. Rule number 1 echoed in her head. "You do not step foot inside my house. Ever." She looked at the barn, at the freezing air, the dirty straw, and the man bleeding out into the muck to save her livestock. To hell with the rules. "Get up," Evie ordered, grabbing his uninjured right arm and pulling it over her shoulder. "We are going to the house." Silas cracked one eye open. "Rule 1, Evie." He managed a weak, cynical drawl. "I make the rules and I can break them. Move, Holden." It took them 10 grueling minutes to cross the muddy yard. The storm raged around them, the wind trying to knock them flat. Silas's heavy iron shackle dragged through the thick mud, an anchor of dead weight pulling him down. By the time they kicked open the front door of the cabin and stumbled into the dry warmth of the kitchen, Silas was dangerously pale. "Sit," Evie commanded, shoving him into one of the sturdy oak chairs at the kitchen table. She flew into a flurry of motion. She stoked the dying embers in the hearth, throwing on kindling until a roaring fire leaped to life. She grabbed a bottle of Arthur's cheap whiskey from the cupboard, a clean needle, a spool of thick black silk thread, and a stack of clean towels. When she turned back to the table, Silas was staring blankly at the dancing flames in the hearth. The blood had pooled on the wooden floorboards beneath his chair. "This is going to be brutal," Evie said, her voice trembling as she struck a match and held the steel needle over the flame to sterilize it. "I don't have ether. I don't have laudanum." "Just pour the rot gut on it and sew, Evie," Silas gritted out, his jaw clenched tight. Evie uncorked the whiskey. "Bite down," she said, handing him a folded leather belt from the counter. Silas put the leather between his teeth. He gripped the edge of the heavy oak table with his right hand, his knuckles turning white. Evie poured the whiskey directly into the gaping wound. Silas let out a muffled feral roar through the leather. His entire body violently locked up, every muscle vibrating with blinding agony. The chair creaked dangerously under his weight. I know, I'm sorry," Evie whispered frantically. She quickly pressed a towel to the wound to clear the blood, then threaded the needle. She stood close to him, closer than she had ever been to a man since Arthur died. As she leaned over his arm, she could feel the heat radiating from his bare chest. She smelled the rain in his dark hair, the coppery tang of his blood, and the sharp bite of the whiskey. She pushed the needle through the tough, scarred skin of his arm. Silas flinched, but then forced himself perfectly, terrifyingly still. As Evie worked, pulling the edges of the jagged wound together with precise, even stitches, Silas opened his eyes. He didn't look at his arm. He looked directly at her. His storm-gray eyes traced the curve of her jaw, the dark, wet lashes framing her amber eyes, the fierce concentration etched into her delicate features. He watched the way her hands trembled slightly before every stitch, yet never wavered when the needle pierced his flesh. She was terrified of hurting him, yet ruthless enough to do what had to be done. He had never known a woman like her. In his world, women were either victims to be avenged or saloon girls looking for a quick coin. Evie was a survivor. She was steel wrapped in silk. Almost done, Evie murmured, tying off the final knot and snipping the thread. She had placed 16 stitches. She carefully wrapped a clean white bandage around his bicep, binding it tight. When she stepped back, her hands were covered in his blood. Silas spat the leather belt onto the table. He was breathing heavily, his forehead slick with sweat. He looked at the pristine bandage, then up at her. You have steady hands, widow. Go sleep on the rug by the fire, Evie said, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. I'll fetch you a blanket. If you go back out to that freezing barn, you'll catch pneumonia, and then I'll have wasted my good thread. Silas didn't argue. He dragged himself to the hearth, heavily lowering his battered body onto the thick braided rug. Hours later, the storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic rain. Evie sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching him sleep. The blood loss and exhaustion had pushed Silas into a fever. He tossed restlessly on the rug, the iron chain clinking softly against the floorboards. Elias, Silas muttered in his sleep, his voice a broken, agonizing rasp. His uninjured hand clawed at the blanket. Jackson, they're in the trees. Jackson, get down. Evie leaned forward, her heart aching. They burned them, Silas whispered, a solitary tear escaping his closed eye and cutting a clean path through the soot on his cheek. Left me the ashes. I'll kill him. I'll kill him. Evie quietly left her chair. She knelt on the rug beside him, taking a cool, damp cloth and pressing it gently to his burning forehead. Shh, she murmured, brushing a damp lock of dark hair from his brow. You're safe. They're gone. Silas's frantic tossing slowed. His head leaned slightly into the coolness of her hand. For the first time, Evie didn't see a wraith. She didn't see a lethal bounty hunter or a chained convict. She saw a profoundly broken man carrying the ghosts of people he had loved and lost, just like her. She sat beside him on the floor for the rest of the night, listening to the rain, wondering how long they could keep pretending this was just a business arrangement. 4 days later, the New Mexico sun had baked the muddy yard back into a cracked, hardened crust. Silas's arm was healing, a testament to his stubborn constitution and Evie's meticulous stitching, but the flour barrel was empty, the coffee tin was rattling, and they needed fresh bandages. Avoiding Dust Haven was no longer an option. Evie sat on the driver's bench of the wagon, wearing her immaculate black morning dress. Silas sat beside her. He had insisted on riding up front, a silent, imposing sentinel, his rifle resting casually across his lap. The heavy iron shackle was still locked securely around his ankle, the chain draped over the floorboards. As they drove down the main street of Dust Haven, the town's reaction was instantaneous and suffocating. The lively chatter on the boardwalks died. Women in their Sunday best pulled their children behind their skirts, glaring at Evie with a mixture of pity and utter disgust. Men lounging outside the saloon stopped whittling, their eyes tracking Silas with a blend of morbid curiosity and palpable fear. The widow who bought a devil, the whispers seemed to echo off the wooden facades of the buildings. Arthur Hayes hasn't been cold in the ground a year, and she's already riding beside a chained killer. Evie kept her chin high, her spine rigid. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her shame. Silas felt the hostility radiating from the street. He shifted his weight, his eyes sweeping the rooftops and alleyways, cataloging every man with a gun. He hated the way they looked at her. He was used to the fear and the disgust. It was his armor. But seeing that same venom directed at Evie stirred a dark, violent protectiveness deep within his chest. Evie pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Abernathy's general store. "Stay here," she told Silas, setting the brake. "Not a chance," Silas replied. He climbed down from the wagon. Clink, drag. The sound of the iron chain hitting the boardwalk was deafening in the quiet street. Evie sighed, but didn't argue. She walked into the dim, heavily scented interior of the general store, Silas a towering, ominous shadow right behind her. Mr. Abernathy, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, swallowed hard as they approached the counter. Mrs. Hayes, what can I do for you?" 50 pounds of flour, Mr. Abernathy. 5 pounds of coffee beans, a spool of barbed wire, and 2 bottles of carbolic acid," Evie said clearly, placing a gold coin on the glass counter. Abernathy glanced nervously at Silas, then back to the coin. I don't know if I have the wire, ma'am. Mr. Croft came through yesterday and bought up most of our supplies. Said he's expanding his east pasture." "Check the back room, Horace," a smooth, cultured voice echoed from the open doorway of the store. Evie froze. Silas's hand drifted instinctively to the butt of his Colt. Harlan Croft stepped into the general store. He was a striking man in his early 50s, dressed in a tailored three-piece suit that looked entirely out of place in the dusty frontier town. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick, and his smile was a cold, practiced slither. Flanking him was a massive, scarred enforcer Silas didn't recognize, a replacement for the terrified Cullen. "I believe I left a spool or two for the lesser ranches," Croft continued, walking forward until he stood just a few feet from Evie. He tipped his expensive bowler hat. "Good afternoon, Evelyn. I must say, morning black suits your complexion beautifully, though I'm surprised you're still wearing it, considering you've taken a new pet." Croft's dark eyes slid past Evie, landing on Silas with an expression of supreme aristocratic disdain. He looked at the iron chain around Silas's boot, then let out a soft chuckle. "I heard the rumors," Croft mused. "Evelyn Hayes bought a chained dog to keep her warm at night. Tell me, Holden, isn't it? Does she let you sleep at the foot of the bed, or do you stay in the yard where you belong?" Silas's jaw locked. The urge to draw his gun and put a bullet directly through Croft's tailored vest was nearly overwhelming. But if he shot Croft here, in front of witnesses, he would hang, and Evie would lose the ranch today. He remained perfectly still, a statue of coiled violence. "What do you want, Harlan?" Evie demanded, her voice cutting like a whip. "I want to help you, my dear," Croft said smoothly. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of bank paper. He held it out to her. "This town is no place for a woman alone, especially a woman who makes such erratic decisions out of grief. Arthur was a sensible man. He knew when he was outmatched. He knew when to bow out gracefully. Don't make the same mistake your husband did, Evelyn. Sign the deed, take the money. Leave Dust Haven before your new toy turns rabid and bites you." Evie looked at the check. It was a fortune, enough to buy a house in San Francisco to live comfortably for the rest of her days far away from the blood and the dust. She looked at Harlan Croft, the man who had orchestrated Arthur's murder. Then she looked over her shoulder at Silas. Silas was watching her, his storm-gray eyes unreadable, waiting. He fully expected her to take it. Why wouldn't she? It was the smart play. It was the safe play. He was just an indentured criminal, a temporary shield. Evie turned back to Croft. She didn't swat the check away. She simply ignored it. Instead, in front of Harlan Croft, in front of the gaping Mr. Abernathy, and in clear view of the gossiping townspeople loitering outside the open windows, Evelyn Hayes took a half-step backward. She reached out and firmly grasped Silas's right hand. Silas physically jolted. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. She threaded her delicate fingers through his calloused, scarred ones, interlocking them in a blatant, undeniable display of intimacy and possession. "His name is Silas Holden," Evie said, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the quiet store. "He is not a ward. He is not a dog. He is my legally wedded husband." Croft's arrogant smile faltered, his eyes dropping to their joined hands in genuine shock. "And as for Arthur," Evie continued, her chin tilting upward, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying light, "Arthur's mistake was thinking you were a man of honor who could be reasoned with. I do not share his delusion. I will never sell you my land, Harlan, not for all the gold in the territory. If you want it, you will have to bury me on it." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't done in years. The warmth of her hand in his felt like a branding iron, burning away the cold, cynical shell he had lived inside for so long. She wasn't hiding behind him. She was standing with him. She was claiming him in front of the devil himself. Croft slowly withdrew the check, slipping it back into his pocket. His eyes turned flat, dead, and utterly merciless. "A bold speech, Evelyn," Croft whispered softly, "but incredibly foolish. You think a rusted chain and a broken-down bounty hunter can stop what's coming? You're playing a game of blood, little widow, and you have no idea how to bleed." "He doesn't," Silas finally spoke. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards. Silas stepped forward, pulling Evie slightly behind him, though he did not let go of her hand. He stared down at Croft, releasing a fraction of the lethal, terrifying aura that had made him a legend. "But I do. Send your men, Croft. Send all of them. I'll build a fence out of their bones." Croft stared back for a long, tense moment. Then he tipped his hat once more. "Good day, Mrs. Holden. Enjoy your ranch, while it lasts." Croft turned and swept out of the store, his massive enforcer trailing behind him. Mr. Abernathy was practically vibrating behind the counter. He quickly began throwing bags of flour and coffee into a burlap sack, desperate to get them out of his store. Evie paid, her hand still trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. As they walked back out into the blinding sunlight and loaded the wagon, the townspeople actively backed away, parting like the Red Sea. They had seen the confrontation. They had seen the joined hands. Silas climbed up into the wagon seat beside her. He looked down at the iron shackle on his ankle, and then he looked at the woman sitting next to him. She had bought him to be a shield. He had married her to use her home as a sniper's nest. But as the wagon rolled out of Dust Haven, leaving the whispering town behind, Silas knew the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. Evie had publicly tied her fate to his. She had looked the most dangerous man in the territory in the eye, and claimed a chained convict as her own. Silas Holden looked up at the road ahead, his jaw setting into granite. Harlan Croft wanted a war. Silas would give him a massacre. He would burn this entire territory to ash before he let anyone lay a finger on Evelyn Holden. The fragile truce between them lasted exactly 3 days before the past tore it to shreds. Autumn was creeping into the high country, bringing a bitter, biting chill that seeped through the cracks of the cabin's timber walls. Evie had quietly amended rule number 1. Silas was allowed inside the house during the daylight hours to repair the crumbling stone hearth in the parlor, provided he stayed on his side of the room. It was a quiet, almost domestic afternoon. The only sounds were the scrape of Silas's trowel against the limestone, the rhythmic clink of his iron shackle whenever he shifted his weight, and the soft crackle of the small fire Evie had built in the cast-iron stove. Silas knelt on the braided rug, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, digging out the brittle, century-old mortar from the base of the hearth. He wedged the edge of his iron trowel beneath a particularly stubborn blackened flagstone and leaned his weight into it. With a sharp crack, the heavy stone popped loose, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity in the foundation. Silas paused, his brow furrowing. It wasn't an animal burrow or a natural sinkhole. It was a perfectly squared hollow lined with cedar planks, and resting at the bottom was a rectangular tin box wrapped tightly in oilcloth. "Evie," Silas called out, his voice a low rumble. Evie emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She stopped short when she saw the dark hole in her living room floor. "What did you do?" "I didn't do it. Someone built a hidey hole." Silas reached into the cavity and pulled out the heavy tin. He untied the rotting twine and unwrapped the oilcloth, flipping the rusted latch of the box. Inside sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and stiff. Evie walked slowly toward him, her amber eyes wide. She dropped to her knees beside him, her skirts pooling on the floorboards, completely ignoring the dust. She recognized the tooling on the leather instantly. "That's Arthur's handwriting," she whispered, tracing the embossed initials on the cover. "He told me he lost this ledger a year ago." "Open it," Silas said softly. Evie flipped the heavy cover. The first dozen pages were standard ranch accounting: head of cattle, feed costs, fencing supplies. But halfway through the book, the neat columns of numbers vanished, replaced by frantic, cramped paragraphs. Evie began to read aloud, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet cabin. "October 14th. Croft summoned me to town today. He offered $2,000 for the ranch. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He laughed. He said the Central Pacific Railroad survey had been finalized. The tracks are cutting right through the Eastern Valley. They need a water depot. Our deep well and the creek runoff are the only reliable water sources for 40 miles. Croft doesn't want the grazing land. He wants the water rights. Whoever owns this water controls the railroad's purse strings." Silas's jaw tightened. "That's why Croft won't take no for an answer. It's not about cattle. It's about a railroad monopoly. That check he offered you in town, it was pennies compared to what the water rights are actually worth." Evie swallowed hard, turning the page. The entries grew darker, the handwriting erratic. November 2nd. They poisoned the Miller family's well, forced them to sell. Croft is using a new man to do his terrorizing. Not a local thug like Cullen, a professional. The man wears a silver-studded gun belt and has a black serpent tattooed up the left side of his neck. They call him Elias. Silas went absolutely, terrifyingly still. The air in the cabin seemed to instantly drop 20 degrees. Evie didn't notice the sudden lethal tension radiating from the man beside her. She was entirely focused on the final entry in the book dated just 2 days before Arthur's death. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. November 18th. Elias cornered me outside the bank. He showed me his gun. He told me that if I didn't sign the deed over to Croft, Evie would wake up a widow and then they would burn her in her bed. I cannot fight a man like Croft, and I cannot outgun a killer like Elias. I am a coward. I know they are going to kill me. I am hiding the deed and this ledger here. If I die, Evie gets the land, and maybe the law will find this book and protect her. May God forgive me for leaving her alone." Evie dropped the book onto the floorboards, letting out a choked, ragged sob. She covered her face with her flour-dusted hands. Her husband hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had been hunted. He had known the bullet was coming. And instead of fighting, instead of warning her so they could run together, he had simply surrendered to his own slaughter out of fear. He had left her utterly defenseless in a canyon of wolves. Silas didn't reach out to comfort her. He couldn't. His entire world had just tunneled down to a single name written in faded ink: Elias. The man with the serpent tattoo. The assassin who had slit the throats of Silas's brothers in arms while they slept by the fire in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Silas had tracked that serpent tattoo for 2 years, following a trail of blood across 3 states right into the dust of this miserable town. Elias Vance, Silas whispered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Evie slowly lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face snapping toward him. "What did you say?" Silas looked at her, his storm-gray eyes utterly hollow. "Elias Vance. He's Croft's top enforcer. He's the man who framed me for murder and put me in that jail cell." Evie stared at him, her brilliant mind working frantically, connecting the scattered bleeding dots. She remembered the way Silas had surveyed her property the moment he stepped off the wagon. She remembered his cold, tactical assessment of the high ground, the cliff face, the sightlines to town. "You knew," Evie breathed, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. She scrambled backward on the rug, putting distance between them. "You didn't just come to Dust Haven by accident. You were hunting him." Silas didn't lie. He couldn't lie to her anymore. "Yes. And when I walked into that jail cell, when I offered to buy your life..." Evie's voice cracked, a devastating mix of betrayal and fury rising in her chest. "You looked at me, and you didn't see a woman begging for her survival. You saw a watchtower. You saw a sniper's nest. Evie, listen to me." "You used me!" Evie screamed, surging to her feet. She snatched the heavy ledger off the floor and threw it at him. It struck his chest with a dull thud. "You let me chain you to my wagon because you knew Harlan Croft would eventually send his men up here to take my land. You're using my home as bait for your revenge." Silas stood up slowly. Clink. Drag. The sound of his chain was no longer a symbol of her control. It was a mockery. He had allowed her to put the leash on him because it suited his war. "I am an outlaw, Evie," Silas said, his voice a harsh, unapologetic rasp. "I am a wraith. What did you think you were buying? A saint? A gentleman? You bought a killer to keep the other killers away, and that is exactly what I'm doing." "Get out!" Evie sneered, pointing a trembling finger toward the heavy oak front door. Her amber eyes blazed with a fierce, wounded pride. "I thought Arthur was a coward for hiding the truth from me. But you manipulated me. You let me think we were fighting the same war. Get out of my house, Silas. Go back to your barn, and don't you dare step foot over my threshold again." Silas looked at her. He saw the profound, jagged betrayal cutting through her. He wanted to tell her that it had changed. He wanted to tell her that when she had taken his hand in the general store, his desire for revenge had been eclipsed by a terrifying, all-consuming need to keep her safe. But he didn't have the words. He only had the blood on his ledger. Without a word, Silas turned and walked out the door. The heavy iron chain dragged across the porch, the rhythmic clinking fading into the cold autumn wind as he retreated to the shadows of the barn, leaving Evie alone with the ashes of her husband's cowardice. For 4 agonizing days, they existed in a suffocating, frozen silence. Silas chopped wood until his hands bled. He fixed the corral, mended the barbed wire, and stood guard in the hayloft with his Winchester rifle resting on the sill. Evie brought him plates of hot food, leaving them silently on the chopping block in the yard. She wouldn't look at him. The betrayal had built a wall of thick, impenetrable ice between them. It took a spark to burn that wall to the ground. It happened on a moonless Tuesday, shortly after midnight. Silas was lying on his cot in the tack room, fully clothed, his boots still on, his revolver resting lightly across his chest. He was hovering in that restless liminal space between waking and dreaming when the scent hit him, not wood smoke from a hearth, the sharp, acrid chemical stench of kerosene. Silas's eyes snapped open. He rolled off the cot, ignoring the heavy clank of his chain, and sprinted for the barn doors. He shoved them open just as a massive, blinding whoosh of orange light erupted in the center of the yard. 3 men on horseback were circling the main cabin. They wore dark bandanas over their faces, holding blazing torches aloft. One of them hurled a glass bottle filled with kerosene directly at the wooden planks of Evie's front porch. The glass shattered, and the dry pine instantly went up in a roaring 15-foot wall of fire. "Burn the witch out!" one of the riders screamed. "Evie!" Silas roared. He didn't think. He didn't take cover. Silas drew his heavy Colt .45, cocked the hammer, and stepped out into the open, illuminated by the hellish orange glow. He leveled the gun and fired twice in rapid succession. The heavy slugs tore through the night. The rider nearest the porch shrieked as a bullet shattered his collarbone, throwing him violently from the saddle. The other 2 men wheeled their panicked horses around, raising their revolvers. They fired blindly into the shadows. Bullets kicked up the dirt around Silas's boots, one whining viciously past his ear, but he didn't flinch. He walked forward, his iron chain dragging heavily. A demon bathed in the firelight. He fired a 3rd time, dropping the second rider's horse to the ground. "It's the Wraith! Ride, damn you!" the last mounted thug screamed, spurring his horse toward the eastern ridge. The uninjured man scrambled out from under his dead mount and fled into the dark pines on foot. Silas didn't give chase. He didn't care about Croft's nameless thugs. His entire being was focused on the cabin. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, hungrily consuming the dry timber of the porch and licking up the front walls toward the cedar shingle roof. Thick, choking black smoke billowed into the night sky. "Evie!" Silas screamed again, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. He ran toward the blaze, the heat blistering the skin on his face. The heavy oak front door kicked open. Evie stumbled out onto the edge of the burning porch, coughing violently, a wool blanket clutched tightly over her nose and mouth. She was wearing only her white cotton nightgown, her dark hair wild and unbound around her shoulders. In her other arm, clutched tightly to her chest, was Arthur's leather-bound ledger. "Jump!" Silas commanded, reaching the edge of the porch just as the wooden awning above her began to groan and sag. Evie leaped off the burning steps. Silas caught her mid-air, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and twisting his body to absorb the impact as they hit the dirt yard. They rolled twice, coming to a halt yards away from the inferno. Silas immediately pushed himself up, his hands frantically checking her arms, her face, her hair for burns. "Are you hurt? Did you breathe the smoke? Evie, talk to me." Evie coughed, her lungs burning, but she nodded frantically. "I'm okay, I'm fine. Silas, I got the ledger, I got the proof." She held the thick leather book up, a triumphant, desperate gleam in her amber eyes. "We can take this to the federal marshal. We can end Croft." Silas let out a ragged breath of relief, resting his forehead against hers for a fleeting second. "Good. You did good, Evie." But as he pulled back, he saw her eyes dart past his shoulder. The triumph vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute soul-crushing devastation. Silas turned. The fire had breached the front parlor and was rapidly spreading toward the back bedroom. "My mother's chest," Evie whispered, the words breaking on a sob. She dropped the ledger in the dirt, her hands rising to cover her mouth. "Her wedding dress, the silver combs, the letters, it's all in there. It's the only thing I have left of her." She took a step toward the roaring inferno. Silas grabbed her waist, hauling her backward. "No, Evie, it's a death trap. The roof is going to cave in." "Let me go!" she screamed, fighting him with the ferocity of a wild cat, her fists pounding against his chest. "Silas, please! It's all I have! It's all I have left!" Silas looked at the woman thrashing in his arms. He looked at the tears cutting through the soot on her beautiful face. He had spent his whole life watching people lose everything they loved, and he had done nothing but tally the bodies and collect the bounties. Not tonight. Not her. Silas shoved Evie hard backwards, sending her sprawling safely into the dirt. "Stay there!" Silas roared. Before she could comprehend what he was doing, Silas turned and sprinted directly into the burning cabin. "Silas, no!" Evie shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her voice tearing her throat raw. Silas vanished into the wall of black smoke and orange flames. Inside the cabin was a vision of hell. The heat was utterly paralyzing, instantly singeing his eyelashes and the hair on his arms. He dropped low to the floorboards, crawling through the thick, toxic smoke toward the back bedroom. The roar of the fire was deafening, a living, breathing monster consuming everything in its path. He found the bedroom. The heavy cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed. It was locked with heavy brass clasps and weighed easily 80 pounds. Silas grabbed the brass handles. The metal was already blistering hot. He hissed in pain but didn't let go. He hauled the heavy chest up into his arms, using his broad chest to shield the wood from the sparks raining down from the ceiling. Above him, the main support beam of the roof let out a terrifying, bone-rattling crack. Silas lunged for the doorway. He barreled through the burning parlor just as the ceiling caved in behind him. A shower of flaming debris struck him squarely across his back and left shoulder. The intense, searing agony of the burn ripped a guttural roar from his throat. But he didn't drop the chest. He hit the front door like a battering ram, bursting out into the cool night air and violently throwing the heavy cedar chest out into the dirt yard. Silas collapsed to his knees in the dust, gasping for air, the back of his shirt smoldering. "Silas!" Evie threw herself into the dirt beside him. She grabbed the smoldering fabric of his shirt, frantically beating out the embers with her bare hands, uncaring that she was burning her own palms. When the embers were dead, she grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Her amber eyes were wide, panicked, and furious. Smack! Evie slapped him across the cheek. It was a sharp, ringing blow that echoed in the yard. Silas blinked, stunned, the sting on his cheek barely registering over the agony in his back. "You stupid, reckless, arrogant bastard!" Evie screamed, fresh tears streaming down her soot-stained face. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined shirt, shaking him with a terrifying, desperate strength. "Why did you do that? It's just a box of old lace and paper. You could have died. You could have burned to death for a box." Silas looked at her, his chest heaving, his storm-gray eyes stripping away every layer of armor he had ever worn. "Because it was yours," he rasped, his voice raw from the smoke. "And because I have nothing else in this world to lose, Evie, except you." Evie froze. The anger instantly drained out of her, replaced by a devastating, overwhelming realization. The icy wall between them shattered completely, melting away in the heat of the fire burning behind them. She let out a broken sob and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. Silas's massive arms immediately wrapped around her waist, pulling her fiercely against his chest. He didn't care about the burns on his back. He didn't care about the iron chain biting into his ankle. He only cared that she was safe, and that she was holding him like he was a man worth saving. Evie pulled back just enough to look at his face. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the dark hair at the nape of his neck and pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and completely inevitable. It tasted of wood smoke, salt tears, and the metallic tang of blood. Silas groaned, a deep, primal sound vibrating in his chest, as his hand tangled in her wild, dark hair. He kissed her back with all the starved, violent passion of a man who had spent a lifetime in the dark and had finally found the sun. They knelt together in the dirt of the yard, clinging to one another like survivors of a shipwreck, kissing as the cabin burned to the ground behind them, reducing the ghosts of their past to nothing but ash and embers. The morning sun rose over a graveyard of smoking timber and gray ash. Where the Hayes cabin had proudly stood for 5 years, nothing remained but a blackened stone chimney and the charred skeletal remains of the porch. The air was thick with the bitter stench of wet soot. Inside the barn, bathed in the pale, dusty light of dawn, the brutal reality of the night before settled over them. Silas sat bare-chested on the edge of the canvas cot. Evie stood between his parted knees, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped a thick layer of clean white gauze around his torso, binding the horrific, blistering burns across his shoulders. Neither of them had spoken about the kiss. They hadn't needed to. The profound, desperate shift in the air between them was undeniable. Every brush of Evie's fingers against Silas's skin sent a heavy electric jolt through his blood. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, the soot smudged across her cheek, and the fierce protective concentration in her amber eyes. "You should have left me to burn," Evie whispered, breaking the heavy silence. She tied off the bandage, her knuckles brushing the uninjured skin over his heart. Silas reached up, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her wrist. "I'd burn the whole world down before I let a single ember touch you, Evie. You know that now." Evie looked up, her breath catching as she met his storm-gray eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to finally give a name to the terrifying, beautiful thing blooming in the ashes of her life, but the words were stolen by the sudden, thunderous drumming of hooves. Silas's head snapped toward the barn doors. His romantic vulnerability vanished in a heartbeat, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal instincts of the wraith. He stood up, wincing as the burned skin stretched across his back, and grabbed his heavy Colt revolver from the tack trunk. "Stay behind me," he ordered, stepping toward the cracked barn doors. A posse of 10 armed men had ridden into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of ash. At the head of the group was Harlan Croft, looking impeccably tailored and utterly triumphant. Beside him rode Sheriff Miller, looking nauseous, and a severe gray-haired man in a black suit, Federal Circuit Judge Harrison. And flanking Croft on the right was a lean, hollow-eyed man wearing a silver-studded gun belt. Coiling up the left side of his neck, visible above his collar, was the dark ink of a serpent tattoo. Elias. Silas thumbed the hammer of his Colt, his blood turning to ice. Elias Vance, the assassin. The ghost he had hunted for 2 agonizing years was sitting not 50 yards away. "Silas Holden!" Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the ruined yard. "Drop your weapon and step out into the light." Evie pushed past Silas's arm, stepping out of the barn with Arthur's ledger clutched tightly to her chest. "By whose authority?" she shouted, her voice ringing with defiance. "Silas is my legal ward. Under the Indentured Labor Act, he is under my protection until his hearing." Judge Harrison pulled a rolled parchment from his saddlebag. "That contract is null and void, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Croft brought it to my attention that the prisoner engaged in an unprovoked, violent assault on his ranch hands yesterday morning. Attempted murder with a deadly weapon. That is a direct violation of the indentured terms. The pardon is revoked." "They were trespassing," Evie screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Croft. "They came to poison my well. And last night they burned my house to the ground. I have proof. I have my husband's ledger documenting every murder Croft has orchestrated." Croft's eyes narrowed dangerously at the mention of the ledger, but he masked it with a smooth, patronizing smile. "The poor woman is hysterical, Judge. The fire clearly addled her mind. I was miles away in town." "You're a liar." Evie stepped forward, but Silas's heavy arm caught her across the collarbone, pulling her back. "Look at the rooftops, Evie," Silas murmured, his voice incredibly low. Evie glanced up. Perched on the limestone ridge above the barn, completely hidden from the main road, were 3 more of Croft's men holding Winchester rifles. The barrels were aimed directly at Evie's chest. If Silas fired his gun, if he made a single move toward Elias or Croft, Evie would be dead before his bullet even cleared the chamber. Croft hadn't come for an arrest. He had come to execute a checkmate. "Holden," Elias drawled, his voice like grinding glass. He rested his hand on the butt of his pistol, a cruel, knowing smirk twisting his scarred face. "Be a good dog and put the iron down, or the widow catches a breeze through her lungs." Silas stared at the serpent tattoo. Every instinct, every ounce of grief and rage he had harbored for 2 years, screamed at him to pull the trigger. He could kill Elias right now. He could finally avenge his fallen brothers. But he felt Evie trembling against his side. Silas slowly uncocked the hammer of his Colt. With a sickening feeling of absolute defeat, he tossed the heavy revolver into the ash-covered dirt. "Take him," Judge Harrison ordered. Sheriff Miller dismounted, pulling a pair of heavy steel Smith & Wesson handcuffs from his belt. He walked forward, his eyes glued to the dirt, and ratcheted the cuffs tightly around Silas's wrists. "No!" Evie thrashed against the deputy who stepped forward to hold her back. "Silas, don't let them do this! Silas!" Though Silas didn't look back at her as they dragged him toward the sheriff's wagon. If he looked at her, he would break. The Dust Haven jail was freezing. Silas sat on the stone floor, his wrists bound in iron, leaning against the cold, damp wall. He was scheduled to hang at high noon tomorrow. The judge hadn't even bothered to set a trial. He had simply reinstated the original execution order. At midnight, the heavy iron door of the cell block groaned open. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway, lantern in hand. Behind him, draped in her black mourning cloak, was Evie. "5 minutes, Mrs. Hayes," Miller muttered, stepping out into the hall and closing the heavy oak door to give them a sliver of privacy. Evie rushed to the iron bars, dropping to her knees on the filthy stone. Her amber eyes were red-rimmed and swollen from crying, but her jaw was set in a line of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. She reached through the bars, her small hands frantically grasping the lapels of his ruined, soot-stained shirt. "I'm getting you out," Evie whispered fiercely. "I rode to the Miller Ranch. I rode to the Chenoweths. I showed them Arthur's ledger. They know Croft poisoned their wells. They're angry, Silas. We are going to march on the gallows tomorrow." Silas looked at her, his heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She was so brave. She was so beautifully, foolishly brave. But Croft had Elias. Croft had a small army of professional killers. If Evie marched on the gallows tomorrow, Croft would slaughter her in the street. There was only one way to keep her alive. He had to break her heart. He had to make her run. Silas reached up with his cuffed hands and peeled her fingers off his shirt. He pushed her hands gently back through the iron bars. "Stop it, Evie," Silas said. His voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the flat, dead voice of the Wraith. Evie blinked, confused. "Silas?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of official parchment. He had forced the sheriff to bring it to him an hour ago. He slid it through the bars, letting it flutter to the stone floor at her knees. "It's an annulment," Silas said coldly. "Signed by me. Judge Harrison agreed to stamp it. It legally dissolves our marriage. The property reverts solely to you." "I don't understand," Evie breathed, staring at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "I'm a dead man walking, Evie. The game is over," Silas lied, forcing his eyes to turn as hard and gray as winter ice. "I told you what I am. I used you to get to Elias. I got careless and Croft outplayed me. There is no grand victory here. Take the annulment. Go to Croft tomorrow morning, sell him the water rights, take his check, and get on the first train to San Francisco." "No." Evie shook her head, a desperate broken sound escaping her throat. "No, you don't mean that. Last night in the fire!" "Last night was adrenaline and smoke," Silas cut her off, his voice rising in manufactured cruelty. Every word felt like he was swallowing broken glass. "You were a mark, Evelyn. A convenient shield. And now the shield is broken. Don't be a fool. Sign the paper and leave." Evie stared at him. The silence in the dungeon was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Silas waited for the slap. He waited for her to spit in his face, to turn around and walk away, hating him forever. It was the only way she would survive. Instead, Evelyn Hayes reached down, picked up the annulment paper, and methodically tore it perfectly in half, then into quarters. She let the pieces flutter to the muddy floor. "You are an exceptionally terrible liar, Silas Holden," Evie whispered. Before Silas could react, Evie reached her arms through the iron bars. She grabbed the collar of his shirt with terrifying strength and violently yanked him forward. Silas's chest slammed against the iron bars. Evie crushed her mouth against his. It wasn't a sweet kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and furious. Silas's eyes widened in shock. his cuffed hands rising instinctively to grip the bars. He opened his mouth to pull away, to tell her to stop, but the moment his lips parted, Evie's tongue swept inside. He felt the metallic click against his teeth. Silas froze. Evie pulled back, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a fierce, triumphant fire. Silas closed his mouth. Sitting heavy and cold under his tongue was a tiny, intricately cut piece of brass. "When we went to the general store to buy supplies," Evie whispered, her lips swollen, her voice barely a breath in the dark, "I paid the blacksmith $20 to forge a universal skeleton key for the Territorial Marshal's Smith & Wesson cuffs, because I knew eventually Harlan Croft would try to put you back in a cage." Silas stared at her in sheer, unadulterated awe. He slowly moved the small brass key from his mouth into his palm, hiding it in the shadows of his cuffs. "I didn't buy you just to watch you die, Silas," Evie vowed, her amber eyes blazing in the dark. "I'm not running. Tomorrow we burn his empire to the ground. Be ready." She turned on her heel and walked out of the dungeon, leaving Silas sitting in the dark, the cold brass key resting in his palm like a promise of absolute, beautiful violence. The midday sun beat down on the dusty main street of Dust Haven, baking the wooden gallows in the center of the square. The heat was oppressive, heavy with the suffocating anticipation of a hanging. Silas stood on the wooden platform, the rough, braided hemp of the noose scratching against the angry burns on his neck. His hands were clasped in front of him, the heavy steel handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. To the massive crowd gathered in the dirt below, he looked like a defeated man taking his final breaths. But beneath his calloused thumb, hidden perfectly within the mechanism of the steel cuffs, the brass key had already been turned. The cuffs were completely unlocked, held together only by the tension of Silas's grip. Judge Harrison stood on the platform beside him, mopping his sweating brow with a silk handkerchief. Behind the executioner's lever stood Sheriff Miller, looking pale and deeply ashamed. And lounging in the shade of the saloon's balcony across the street, a Winchester rifle resting casually over the wooden railing, was Elias Vance. The serpent tattoo on his neck pulsed as he smiled down at the gallows. "Silas Holden," Judge Harrison proclaimed loudly to the crowd, "you have been found guilty of violating the terms of your territorial pardon and of the attempted murder of innocent ranch hands. Have you any final words?" Silas looked out over the sea of faces. He wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for her. "Yeah," Silas rumbled, his voice carrying over the dead silent square. "You better duck, Judge." Before Harrison could comprehend the threat, a massive commotion erupted at the far end of the street. A dozen horses tore around the corner of the livery stable, kicking up a blinding wall of red dust. It wasn't Croft's men. It was the ranchers. Men with calloused hands and sun-leathered faces, armed with double-barrel shotguns, hunting rifles, and old cavalry revolvers. At the head of the charge, riding a towering roan gelding, was Evelyn Holden. She wore no morning black today. She wore a canvas riding jacket, a wide-brimmed hat, and her father's gun belt strapped tightly around her waist. In her raised right hand she held Arthur's thick leather-bound ledger high in the air. "Sheriff Miller!" Evie screamed, pulling her horse to a halt at the edge of the crowd. The ranchers fanned out behind her, a terrifying wall of armed, righteous fury. "Halt this execution! I hold the ledger of Arthur Hayes. It contains documented proof that Harlan Croft poisoned our wells, burned our lands, and ordered the murder of 12 innocent men." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shocked whispers surging through the square. Harlan Croft, who had been standing near the steps of the gallows in his pristine suit, felt the color drain from his face. He looked at the heavily armed ranchers, men he thought he had broken and terrified into submission. They were aiming their rifles directly at him. "This is an outrage," Croft shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Sheriff, arrest that woman. She's lying. The book is a forgery." "It is in his own handwriting," Evie yelled back. She looked directly at the sheriff. "You know Croft is bleeding this town dry, Miller. Are you a lawman, or are you his dog? Look at the proof." Sheriff Miller hesitated, his hands trembling as he looked from Evie to Croft, and then to the angry mob of townsfolk who were suddenly finding their courage. Croft realized he had lost the town. He had lost the sheriff. If that ledger made it to the federal marshal in Santa Fe, he would hang. There was only one way to stop the avalanche. He had to cut off the head of the snake. Croft's hand darted inside his tailored vest. He drew a silver-plated double-barrel derringer and leveled it directly at Evie's chest. "Shut your mouth, widow!" Croft screamed, pulling the trigger. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an agonizing crawl. Silas didn't think. The wraith took over. He threw his hands apart. The unlocked steel handcuffs clattered to the wooden planks of the gallows. Silas lunged forward, throwing his massive body directly into the path of Croft's bullet, just as the derringer cracked. The heavy lead slug tore into Silas's left shoulder, ripping through muscle and grazing his collarbone. Silas grunted, the impact spinning him, but the pain only fueled the absolute terrifying violence exploding in his blood. He reached out with his uninjured right arm, grabbing Judge Harrison by the lapels of his suit. With a violent heave, Silas threw the screaming judge to the floorboards, simultaneously snatching the pearl-handled Colt revolver from the judge's hip holster in one blindingly fast, fluid motion. Above the street, on the saloon balcony, Elias Vance swung his Winchester rifle toward Evie, realizing Croft had missed. Silas didn't even aim. Muscle memory, forged in a decade of blood and gunpowder, took the wheel. He cocked the hammer of the judge's revolver and fired upward. Bang! The bullet struck Elias dead in the center of the chest. The assassin's eyes went wide. His rifle fired harmlessly into the sky as he tipped forward, tumbling over the wooden railing and crashing through the saloon's awning to the dusty street below, dead before he hit the ground. "Elias!" Croft screamed, watching his greatest weapon fall. Croft spun back around, frantically trying to cock the second barrel of his derringer to shoot Silas. But Silas was already standing at the edge of the gallows. He reached up, grabbed the rough hemp noose around his own neck, and yanked it over his head, casting it aside. He leveled the stolen Colt directly at the bridge of Harlan Croft's nose. "Drop it," Silas snarled, his voice a demonic, blood-chilling rumble. Blood poured down his left arm, soaking his shirt, but the hand holding the gun was as steady as solid granite. Croft froze. The derringer shook in his manicured hand. He looked at the bleeding, terrifying bounty hunter aiming at his head. Then he looked behind him. Every single rancher had their rifle cocked and aimed at him. Even Sheriff Miller had drawn his revolver, finally stepping away from the gallows lever and pointing his weapon at the cattle baron. "It's over, Harlan," Sheriff Miller said, his voice finding its strength for the first time in years. "Drop the gun." The silver derringer slipped from Croft's fingers, hitting the dust with a pathetic thud. Croft fell to his knees, raising his hands in surrender as the ranchers swarmed him, dragging him to the dirt and securing his wrists with heavy rope. The square erupted into chaos. Townspeople cheered. Croft's remaining thugs dropped their weapons and fled, and the corrupt Judge Harrison cowered on the floorboards of the gallows. Silas lowered the revolver. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a roaring in his ears and a fiery, sickening pain in his shattered shoulder. His vision swam. He swayed dangerously on the edge of the wooden platform. "Silas!" Evie had thrown herself off her horse before it even fully stopped. She sprinted up the wooden steps of the gallows, her boots pounding against the planks. She caught him just as his knees buckled. Silas collapsed against her, his heavy frame driving them both down to the wooden floorboards. Evie wrapped her arms fiercely around him, her hands pressing desperately against the bleeding wound in his shoulder. "I've got you!" Evie sobbed, pressing her face against his neck, inhaling the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. "I've got you, you stubborn fool! You're safe!" Silas let out a ragged, breathless laugh, his uninjured right arm coming up to wrap tightly around her waist. He buried his face in her dark hair, grounding himself in the scent of lavender and the frantic, beautiful beating of her heart against his chest. "You brought an army, widow," Silas rasped, his voice thick with awe and exhaustion. Evie pulled back just enough to look at him. Her amber eyes were shining with tears, but her smile was the most radiant, breathtaking thing he had ever seen. I told you, Evie whispered, leaning down to press a tender, lingering kiss to his soot-stained lips. I don't break my contracts, Mr. Holden. We fight together, or not at all. As the town of Dust Haven reclaimed its soul in the street below them, Silas pulled his wife closer, knowing for the first time in his life that the war was finally over. He was home. The rhythmic, solid thwack of a hammer echoed across the high plateau, a stark and beautiful contrast to the gunfire that had shattered the valley a month ago. It was late November. The New Mexico air had turned crisp and biting, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles and impending snow. Where the ashes of the old cabin had once smeared the earth, the golden, freshly hewn skeletal frame of a new house now rose proudly against the sprawling western sky. It was larger than the first, with a wider porch and tall windows designed to catch the eastern sunrise. Silas Holden stood on the roof joists, his broad, bare chest gleaming with a light sheen of sweat despite the chill. He swung the framing hammer with a steady, practiced rhythm, driving heavy iron nails deep into the timber. His body was a map of recent survival. The horrific burn across his shoulder blades was healing into thick, silvered tissue, and a raw, puckered scar sat high on his left collarbone, where Harlan Croft's bullet had torn through the meat. But Silas moved with a fluid, unburdened grace he hadn't possessed in over a decade. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward. Down in the yard, the sound of approaching hooves made him pause. He lowered the hammer and looked out toward the ridge. Evie rode into the clearing on a dappled gray gelding, her black Mustang Starling trotting contentedly behind her with the jet-black colt prancing at her heels. Evie wore a tailored riding skirt of deep burgundy and a wool jacket, her dark hair braided and pinned securely beneath a felt hat. She looked vibrant, untamed, and breathtakingly beautiful. The perpetual shadow of grief and paranoia that had once haunted her amber eyes was entirely gone. Silas climbed down the wooden scaffolding with the easy agility of a mountain cat, dropping lightly into the dirt yard just as Evie pulled her horse to a halt. She didn't wait for him to help her down. She swung out of the saddle, her boots hitting the dust, and practically flew across the yard. In her gloved hand, she clutched a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the heavy red wax seal of the territorial governor of New Mexico. "It came," Evie breathed, her chest heaving with excitement as she stopped inches from him. She shoved the heavy envelope against his bare chest. "The stagecoach brought it into Dust Haven an hour ago. Sheriff Miller gave it to me himself. He told me to tell you he hopes you never have to step foot in his jail again." Silas looked down at the official seal, then up into her beaming face. He wiped the sawdust from his hands onto his denim trousers and took the envelope. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and unfolded the heavy parchment. His storm-gray eyes scanned the elegant, looping calligraphy. In light of extraordinary service to the territory, the eradication of a documented criminal syndicate, and the sworn petitions of 22 landowners of Dust Haven County, full, unconditional pardon is hereby granted to Silas Holden. All previous bounties and warrants expunged. Silas stared at the words. He read them twice to ensure his mind wasn't playing a cruel trick on him. The phantom weight of a noose, a weight he had carried around his neck for 10 years, suddenly evaporated into the thin mountain air. "Croft?" Silas asked, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Transferred to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth this morning," Evie smiled, a fierce, satisfied gleam in her eyes. "Judge Harrison is being investigated by the Department of Justice, and the railroad company has officially agreed to our terms for the water rights. We lease them the runoff, but we keep the land. All of it." Silas slowly folded the parchment. He looked out over the sweeping valley, the land he had bled for, the land that was finally, undisputedly safe. Then he looked down at his right boot. Locked securely around his ankle, resting heavily in the dirt, was the thick iron shackle Sheriff Miller had clamped on him the day they met. Silas hadn't taken it off. Even after the shootout, even after they had begun rebuilding, he had left the iron on. It was a reminder of the contract, a tether to the legal arrangement that had bound him to this woman when he had nothing else. But the contract was over. He wasn't an indentured ward anymore. He was a free man. Silas turned and walked silently toward the barn. Evie followed him, her brow furrowing in confusion as he bypassed the house framing and stepped into the dim, leather-scented interior of the tack room. He walked over to the heavy blacksmith's anvil sitting in the corner. He hoisted his right leg up, resting the iron cuff flat against the cold steel of the anvil. He grabbed a heavy, flat-headed steel chisel in his left hand and a 4-pound sledgehammer in his right. "Silas?" Evie asked softly, lingering in the doorway. Silas didn't answer. He wedged the tip of the chisel directly into the locking mechanism of the heavy iron cuff. He raised the sledgehammer. Clang! The deafening sound of steel striking steel echoed through the barn. Sparks flew into the shadows, into the clang. The thick iron locking pin groaned, bending under the immense focused violence of the blows. Silas swung a third time, putting every ounce of his massive strength, every memory of his murdered brothers, every nightmare of the gallows into the strike. Crack! The heavy iron shackles shattered. Silas dropped the tools. He reached down and pulled the broken halves of the cuff away from his ankle. The skin beneath was scarred and calloused, permanently marked by the iron. But as he tossed the heavy metal pieces into the dirt, he felt lighter than he had ever felt in his entire life. He stepped away from the anvil and walked slowly back to the doorway where Evie stood. He stopped right in front of her, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He reached out and gently took her left hand. Resting on her slender ring finger was the ugly, rusted iron washer he had slid onto her hand in the sheriff's office a lifetime ago. It had left a faint, dark ring of oxidation on her skin. "You bought a dead man to be your shield, Evelyn," Silas murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the back of her knuckles. His voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that sent shivers down her spine. "And I married you to use your home as a sniper's nest. We built this on blood and dust and lies." "It kept us alive," Evie whispered, her amber eyes locking onto his, wide and luminous. "Yeah, it did." Silas gently pinched the rusted iron washer between his thumb and forefinger. "But the war is over. The shield is broken. And I don't want to be a ghost anymore." With a smooth, deliberate motion, Silas slid the rusted iron washer off her finger. He didn't toss it away. He slipped it into his pocket, keeping it as a reminder of where they had started. Then he reached into the small leather pouch tied to his belt. He didn't drop to one knee. He wasn't a gentleman of the high society, and Evie wasn't a fragile debutante. They were survivors. They stood eye to eye, equals in the dust. Silas pulled a heavy, gleaming band of solid silver from the pouch. Evie gasped softly. It wasn't a delicate piece of jewelry from a catalog. It was thick, rugged, and beautifully hammered. "I melted down the last of the silver bounty coins I carried," Silas said quietly, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole the breath straight from her lungs. "The blood money, the price on men's heads. I put it in the forge and I burned the past out of it. I forged it into something new, something that belongs only to you." He held the silver band at the tip of her bare ring finger. "I don't want an arrangement, Evie," Silas vowed, stripping away the very last of his armor. "I don't want a contract. I want the woman who stood in front of a firing squad for me. I want the woman who dragged me out of hell. I want you. For as long as there is breath in my lungs." Tears spilled over Evie's thick lashes, tracking through the faint dusting of trail dirt on her cheeks. Her heart swelled until she thought it might break her ribs. She looked at the scarred, dangerous, fiercely loyal man standing before her, the wolf she had tamed, the husband she had chosen. "Put it on," Evie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Put it on, Silas." Silas's scarred mouth curved into a slow, devastatingly genuine smile. He slid the heavy silver band onto her finger. It fit perfectly, covering the dark stain left by the iron. Evie threw her arms around his neck, pulling his head down. Silas caught her by the waist, lifting her effortlessly off her boots as their lips crashed together. It wasn't a kiss of desperation or fear. It was a kiss of absolute triumphant certainty. It tasted of sunlight, of wide open spaces, and of a future finally secured. Silas slowly lowered her back to the earth, but he didn't let her go. He kept her wrapped securely in his arms, his chin resting softly on the top of her head. Together they turned and looked out the open barn doors. The sun was beginning its descent over the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the New Mexico sky in explosive, brilliant strokes of gold, crimson, and violet. The golden light washed over the sturdy pine framing of their new home, casting long, warm shadows across the yard. The past was buried in the ashes behind them. The land stretched out endlessly before them, wild and untamed. And for Silas and Evelyn Holden, the real story was just beginning. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.